What's up, you guys? This is Devin with CenturyFX Studios, back with another video, and today we're talking about the 5D Mark V leak specs, and we kind of seen this coming. Now the 1DX Mark III just came out. Why? Because the Olympics came out. The Olympics coming up. We know it's the Olympics. 1D and the Olympics, they're twins. They're brothers. They work in tandem. They are like this. 1D Olympics. There's not going to be a 1DX out a year, 4-5 years before that Olympic cycle. No. Olympics, 1DX, they're here. So usually when the 1DX comes out, the 5D usually comes out right behind it or a little bit in front of it. It's usually around the same time of year or the same year for that matter. For example, you might be saying, well, Devin, how do you know that for sure? Well, I got some specs right here on my sheet. I'm going to go through it with you. All right, usually it's a 4-year increment thing, right? So the 5D Mark I came around 2005. The 5D Mark II came out in 2008, so that's 3 years, right? But after 2008, 5D Mark II came out in 2008. You got the 5D Mark III 2012, 4 years. 2012 to 2016, 4 years. 5D Mark IV. Now it's 2020, 2021. Time for the 5D Mark V. People are now leaking specs and rumors about the 5D Mark V, and Canon has even mentioned, or in the backhand has mentioned that, or the offhand, we're about to release some new cameras, and it's not just going to be the 1DX Mark III. And they're actually hinting to a EOS R Mark II. But nevertheless, this is what Canon has on the list. Now here are the leaked specs. We got a 42 megapixel sensor, 4K at 60, 8 frames a second, dual pixel autofocus, and a 191 autofocus point system. I'll put that leak spec in there myself, the autofocus point system. And I'm going to tell you why in just a second. But let's analyze the validity of these new 5D Mark V rumored specs. Okay, 42 megapixel sensor. Okay, 42 megapixel sensor. Well, Canon's been rolling with that 30 megapixel sensor for a while. They have it in the EOS R, they have it in the 5D Mark IV, but they also have a big 50 megapixel 5D SR, which we already know megapixels. Canon can do megapixels if they wanted to. That 5D SR is one of the still sharpest resolving cameras in the world right now as far as a DSLR is concerned, and I'm pretty sure they can put a 42 megapixel sensor in this camera with limited to no buffer with RAW files for the 5D Mark V with no problem. I'm pretty sure they can do that. Why? Because the 5D SR has been out for so long and the 5D Mark IV has been out for so long. These are two cameras with high resolution bodies on them. If not, the 5D Mark V, the 5D SR has a high resolution 50 megapixel sensor, but they probably won't be able to shoot pictures that fast without it buffering if it's at 50 megapixels. And people are used to 8 frames, 7 frames, 6 frames a second with the 5D series, at least 6 frames a second with the 5D series. So I don't think they're going to push the megapixels. So 42 megapixels seems plausible to me. And putting a megapixels in a camera is not hard. Well, based off of the information or the research that I've done, putting megapixels in the camera is not hard because Canon went from giving us an 18 megapixel sensor for almost 10 years and all of a sudden they whip out this big 50.6 megapixel sensor camera and they charge us the same price as a regular 5D camera. So that tells me that putting megapixels into a sensor, especially a full frame sensor, is not hard. And chances are, if they've already made a 50 megapixel sensor, a 42 megapixel sensor won't be hard for Canon to make at all because they've done something bigger with a full frame sensor. If anything, they can just, I wouldn't want them to do this, but they could replace the 50 megapixel sensor coming from the 5D SR, slap it into the 5D Mark V, and just make it shoot faster and call it a day. Now, I don't want that to be the only thing, but as far as megapixels, it probably isn't that hard for them to do that. They probably modified a 5D SR sensor that went 50 megapixels, brought the megapixels down, put a better processor on it, and 5D Mark V, because they don't want to have a 50 megapixel slow chunky 5D. They already have one in the 5DS series. So if they're going to come out with a 5DSR Mark II or 5DS Mark II, it's going to probably be a 60 or 80 megapixel camera, but I doubt that the 5D series, as far as the 5D Mark V, it's not going to be in line with that. I think their big 80, 100 megapixel camera is going to be for the 5D SR because they don't want to intertwine camera models like they usually are doing. 7D Mark I, Mark II, and the failed 7D Mark III. I'm not saying anything. 1DX Mark II, 7D Mark III. Okay, so the next spec I want to talk about is the 4K at 60. Now the 5D Mark IV had a 4K at 30. So 4K at 60, I'm pretty sure they're gonna have it. Pretty sure they're gonna have it. Why? Because the 1DX Mark III has it. So there's no reason why not to put it in there, other than to make the fans mad and to protect their cinema line, which I doubt they're gonna do. Why? Because they went up to 5.5K on the 1DX Mark III, so I doubt they're gonna strip features from the 5D Mark V. The 5D is probably more selling of a camera. Don't correct my English here, but it probably sells more than the 1D because it's a cheaper camera. So I doubt they're going to try to strip specs where they can actually sell more on this camera. And especially if they know that one of the Canon cameras can do it, they're probably going to want that 60 frames a second at 4K in the 5D Mark V, and Canon's probably going to give it to us. No fuss. 8 frames a second. This is believable. Why? Because they have the 1DX Mark III at 20 megapixels doing 20 frames a second. So 42 megapixels at 8 frames a second isn't that hard for them to do. I doubt it. If anything, I would think that they could be able to push that all the way up to 10 frames per second. Why? Because you got a 20 megapixel camera and then you got a 40 megapixel camera. 20 megapixel camera can do 20 frames a second. So that would lead me to believe that the 42 megapixel camera can at least do 10 frames a second, or right around 9 frames a second if the math adds up. Because the buffer, based off of the processor, because the processors don't really change, so based off the processing, the buffering, the megapixels are probably going to dictate how fast the camera can go and process based off of what people want. Now, if you had a camera that couldn't process that many files at one time, then you would have an issue. But that 1DX Mark III, they touting it to not really even have a buffer at all. The way they're touting it, you know how they play stuff up. But I'm pretty sure it's going to buffer down at some point. And then it said new dual pixel autofocus. I believe this wholeheartedly. Why? Because when the EOS R came out, the EOS R had a new eye tracking autofocus to add to their dual pixel autofocus and video and live view and things of that nature. They're always trying to improve their autofocusing system, and I don't know it to a T, but I know they're always trying to use firmware to update that stuff. Now, I don't have an EOS R, and I haven't really dived into Canon's mirrorless lineup, but I do know that they're always trying to update it, and they're updating via firmware now. So they're giving us what we want a little bit more often, and they're not charging us for it. So now, since this camera has a new dual pixel autofocus system, I think that the eye tracking autofocus system probably is going to start to rival that of Sony's eye tracking autofocus system, and that makes me excited. And the last spec I want to go over is the 191 autofocus points. You remember saying, well, Devin, the 5D Mark IV has 61 autofocus points. The 5D Mark III has 61 autofocus points. The 5DSR has 61 autofocus points. All of these cameras had 61 autofocus points. Why do you jump from 61 to 191? Well, the 1DX Mark III has a new focusing system of 191 autofocusing points with this new dial on it that allows you to skid past the autofocusing point so you can get optimally to the autofocusing point that you want. Now, I don't have the camera in my hands, of course. I never do because I haven't got sent one. If somebody can send me one, or if Canon can send me one, I can review it. I can show you guys, but I can't because I don't have one right now. But hey, you guys knock on Canon's door and tell them to send me a 1DX Mark III or a 5D Mark V so I can show you guys what it can do and give you a real review on these cameras as they come out, so I can get more views and get more credit for my opinions. But nevertheless, that 191 autofocus point system comes from the 1DX Mark III. I think they're going to recycle it. There's no point. I think it takes them a long time to really challenge that autofocusing point system on those DSLRs. Why? Because the DSLRs really strain the autofocusing point system. Usually you'll get a DSLR like the 5D Mark II and the best focusing point is in the center, or the 60 Mark I or the 60 Mark II. The best focusing points are always located in the center. So that means that whatever way that they make their engineering for their systems, even Nikon is having this problem. Sony doesn't have this problem so much because they jumped to mirrorless, but for some reason, the system in DSLRs makes it hard for you to focus all the way out to the edges. I'm pretty sure that they haven't given us this because they can't give us this. I don't know exactly why, but it doesn't make sense for them to not having focus points all the way out to the edges. I've always wondered, ever since I've seen a camera that's able to do it. But this 191 point autofocus system is probably going to be stripped straight from the 1DX Mark III. So they don't have to do as much work. Now, one thing I am not surprised that nobody has said anything about as far as rumor leaks is the inner body image stabilization. It's probably going to have digital stabilization. And I hate digital anything. Digital implemented anything is pretty much bad except the actual digital image itself. Now you might be saying, Devin, that kind of is confusing. Well, when you have a digital camera, the best thing about the digital camera, I think in my opinion, is the control. You can control pretty much everything about the digital camera. Well, any camera in general. The best thing you can do is control it. But when the camera starts to do these automatic functions like digital stabilization and digital zoom, all these things mean a compromise for the image itself. I'd rather have the straight, dry, raw image straight out of the camera without any tampering of JPEG files, baked in JPEG settings and saturation color and contrast and sharpness. I don't want it to do anything digitally to my image. I want the image straight out of camera. So if anything, I'd rather the sensor move around a little bit but not tamper with the image itself, or I'd rather the lens have stabilization and not tamper with the image that I took already to try to compensate, because then you start to see image artifacts like edges that don't really reach out, or you might have a lower resolution looking image in comparison to other cameras because your camera has now cropped the image in to do some extra digital stabilization that you didn't want it to do in the first place. You'd rather it stabilize via the lens or via the sensor where it doesn't compromise on any image quality to give you what you want. And that, I'm not surprised that Canon didn't put it in this camera, because IBIS is a technology which some people have touted to lower the durability of your camera. It's like having a flip out screen. Now, the lower tier Canon cameras can have flip out screens all they want to. Why? Because people are not paying a lot for them. But if you pay a lot for a camera, Canon is known to be that company of durability and it working the way it should work. You being able to climb up a mountain. But if you climb up a mountain with a 1DX Mark III or a 5D Mark IV or 5D Mark V, and it has a flip out screen, you drop that camera, it falls down the mountain, you go and try to find it, that screen has been ripped off. If you drop it off something big, but these cameras are known to be in dangerous situations. That's why Canon hasn't put an IBIS in there, and they haven't put a flip out screen in these higher tier cameras. But here are some things that I want you guys to think about as I leave you after I've been talking for a long time. But these are some things that I've been thinking about. Canon needs to make two versions of the 5D Mark V. They need to make the 5D Mark V and the 5D Mark V-A. You might be saying, well, why A? Well, they've been doing this for a while. They made the 60D A along with the 60D. They've also made, I think it was a, what other camera did they make that was an A? They've also made a 20D A along with the 20D. They've also made a 70D along with the 7070. These are small incremental changes to a camera. They've also made the 5DS and the 5DSR. These are two separate cameras, two separate beasts to appeal to two separate crowds. So they need to make one camera that's a 5D with IBIS and a flip out screen, because this will definitely suffice everybody that's doing weddings and stuff like that. Now, 60 Mark II is decent at it, but 60 Mark II is touted not to have good dynamic range and all this other stuff with the 6D series. 6D series is always the shunned part of the full frame bodies in Canon. But these two things are needed. This is a separate camera, and then have the durable 5D where people are like, okay, I don't want a 5D that's designed to do all that stuff. As a matter of fact, make a mirrorless hybrid 5D with a flip out screen, and have that flip out screen also have that IBIS inside that camera. Have all these experimental things that you don't know about the durability on one side of the spectrum. Make that the 5D-A, 5D Mark V or 5DX version A, and then make a 5D Mark V or 5DX version that you design that is with your principles, that aligns with your principles, Canon, because people will respect you more. You'll have filled out your full frame lineup, because I know you're coming out with an EOS R Mark II, which really should stay mirrorless. It should only cater to your full frame R lenses. It shouldn't try to be something that's not, even though you can use your EOS lenses with it. I think it should stay with the R lenses. Why? Because you really haven't given us a full frame body with maximum capabilities with 1DX capabilities. So how are you expecting us to use your EOS R Mark II in, you know, a big setting like the Olympics if you don't give us steady results, steady lenses? Keep us in the R lenses and try not to cater so much to the EOS. Yeah, you already have the adapters. I'm pretty sure you're going to keep up with that. But now, don't make this into a DSLR mirrorless hybrid. Make this camera cater to straight mirrorless and up your mirrorless frames per second. Make it dual car size. Give us everything we want in this maximum professional grade EOS R. And now you're really giving your people, your customers, something to think about when it comes to buying a camera. Not only have you filled your full frame lineup up, but you've given them legitimate choices. 2 different versions of the same camera, because I'm pretty sure you guys do that with the cinema series. You have the C100 Mark II, and then you have different frame versions of different cinema cameras. Like you have a full frame version of the C700, where other Super 35 sensors are essentially the same but just slightly different. You can do that with the DSLRs too. Why? Because this is a different type of beast. This mirrorless world is a different type of beast, and Canon has to keep up. I'm done with CenturyFX Studios. I know you guys, I've held you guys a long time, but if you've listened to this part, you've listened to the end, I appreciate you, and keep watching and stay tuned for the next video.